Did you know that Marvel and DC sometimes steal from each other? And by sometimes I mean a lot. Today we're counting down the worst instances from both companies. So before we begin, if you like Comic Island, be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out our Patreon page in the video description below. Now, a while back, Joey reviewed the top 10 Copycat characters. You can check that video out here by clicking on this card that we've put up in the corner. But the idea of it was that he was looking at characters very similar in both Marvel and DC that he liked. These were mostly positive characters that each had taken on an identity of their own and had found a way to sort of be very similar in terms of their powers or their personality, but ultimately distinct in how their characters functioned in some key way. Today we're going to look at the mirror of that. We're going to be looking at characters that very much are just a ripoff of older characters from either Marvel or DC that were later used by Marvel and DC as a sort of basic attempt to make the same character but for their company and under their copyright. There are some pretty bad examples here compared to Joey's list, which had pretty fun characters like Namor and Aquaman. We're looking at more obscure ripoffs where there really isn't much to them other than the fact that they were just an out-and-out copy of an earlier superhero from the past. So with that in mind, let's begin. Number 10. The Guardian, ripoff of Captain America. First up is a pretty amusing story, because we have Captain America introduced in 1941 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, obviously being this huge hit. To this day, he's still this massive, famous character. So it's pretty amusing that 1 year later, DC published the character The Guardian, a practically identical figure, but without the iconic American flag coloring Captain America, and instead just sort of this generic yellow and blue outfit. And guess who created The Guardian? None other than Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Yeah, the same guys basically sold the same character to a different company only 1 year apart. Given that these creators were essentially stealing from themselves, The Guardian isn't the worst example of a ripoff in the world. But The Guardian always had trouble, as he was initially depicted, escaping the fact that he is such a generic copy of Captain America, with only minor differences that hardly felt distinct at all. While Captain America had one child sidekick, The Guardian had a whole team of them called the Newsboy Army. And it's hard to call that an improvement. Decades later, The Guardian would go on to be featured in various interesting stories, and you can actually find out about one right here. Number 9. The Owl, ripoff of Owlman. In 1964, DC introduced a new Batman villain called Owlman. He never really took off, as it would only be much later that Owlman would be used in a much more interesting way on Earth 2. Later that same month, Marvel introduced their own villain called the Owl, who would become a regular foe of Spider-Man, Daredevil, and others over the years. The similarities are a little too strong to be chalked up to sheer coincidence. Both of these were owl-themed villains that were persistent thorns in the side of major superheroes, and both initially faded into obscurity until other writers essentially had to fix both versions of the same boring character, making each of them more interesting and distinct from the original copies.
It doesn't matter.
Number 8. Moon Knight, ripoff of Batman. Almost a decade after he was introduced, Moon Knight was given what was then called multiple personality disorder, a key factor in making the character meaningfully distinct from Batman. But it took 10 years, and before that time, he was rich like Bruce Wayne, and a lot of his early comics had a very similar aesthetic to Neil Adams' famous work with Batman. I like Moon Knight, but there is no denying his origins as a Batman ripoff. Clever writers eventually managed to salvage this character, but it was a long road getting there, and it is worth acknowledging this if we are to ever be honest about the history of Moon Knight. Number 7. Night Thrasher, ripoff of Batman. It shouldn't really surprise anyone that Marvel has, over the years, wanted to copy the wild success of Batman. Though it could be argued they have come close with Spider-Man or Iron Man, I think in reality those characters are far too different to be considered copies of any kind, of any character. And just like how DC doesn't have a real equivalent to Spider-Man or Iron Man, Marvel doesn't have a true equivalent to Batman. or at least not one that ever truly caught on. Night Thrasher, a character created by Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz, always had some interesting aspects to him, but never really caught on in a meaningful way. Probably because he was recognized for what he was and is. In spite of having cool aspects and moments, at the end of the day, he's a dude without powers, but has expert combat skills and tech to make up for it. He literally came out the same year as the Tim Burton movie, at a time when the Batman franchise was really starting to get big, even with adults. There's no other way of looking at it. He's a ripoff of Batman, plain and simple. Number 6. Boomerang, ripoff of Captain Boomerang. In 1960, Captain Boomerang was introduced by DC Comics and was a boring Silver Age villain that threw boomerangs. It's not like he exactly caught on as the world's most popular villain at the time. This is why it's kind of funny to think that 6 years later, Marvel took it upon themselves to release Boomerang, a generic Silver Age villain that threw boomerangs. Years later, both of these characters would become more interesting, thanks to Captain Boomerang's time with the Suicide Squad, and Boomerang's more recent time as a superior foe of Spider-Man. But that would be decades after the fact, and until then, this is a pretty bizarre example of Marvel making a boring copy of what was already a very boring villain to begin with.
No honor among thieves, eh?
Number 5. Lilith Clay, ripoff of Jean Grey. Yeah, this one even rhymes. So Jean Grey is one of the most popular X-Men ever. And as the X-Men started to catch on as their own franchise, 7 years after their introduction, DC started to clearly take notice. A brand new member of the Teen Titans had appeared, Lilith Clay, who was also a red-headed telepath, and also eventually transformed into a slightly more sinister version of herself. This one is so obvious it seems like it should be a parody or something, but it's not. It's just deeply unoriginal and hardly worthy of any further analysis. Number 4. Super Adaptoid, ripoff of Amazo. And now we have a repeat of the Boomerang dilemma, with Marvel once again stealing from a DC villain that was pretty lame and boring to begin with. Amazo was first created in 1960 as a robot built by the mad scientist T.O. Morrow, and was designed to steal the Justice League's superpowers. While that story is well remembered, the same can't be said for Amazo, and he never really caught on as a Justice League villain, mostly because he's not all that cool. You don't really see him until we get into a series of Justice League stories and the writers are clearly digging around for new ideas. At least that's my view of things. And once again, just like Captain Boomerang, 6 years after the introduction of Amazo over at Marvel, a ripoff emerged. The Super Adaptoid was built by Advanced Ideas Mechanics and was designed to steal the powers of the Avengers. Both of these robotic villains have stuck around since then for reasons I don't think I'll ever quite understand, as unlike the Boomerang clones, neither of these power-stealing robots ever got too interesting or noteworthy. It really baffles me that Marvel ever bothered ripping off Amazo to begin with. Number 3. Telos, ripoff of the Beyonder. The worst thing about this one, if you ask me, is how recent it all is, with Telos being introduced in 2015. He's certainly not famous as a ripoff the way other characters on this top 10 are, but hear me out on this one. I think it's the newer ripoffs that are harder to excuse to begin with, because it's easy to write off Silver Age antics as a byproduct of a very different era of comic book publishing, but Telos is a very recent ripoff at DC trying to beat Marvel to the punch when it came to Marvel's 2015 Secret Wars event. It seems as if DC managed to get wind of it relatively early on, and they were able to rush out a vaguely similar event just before Secret Wars came out, called Convergence. And I'm not a big fan of Convergence, though it had some cool tie-ins, the main story was a real mess. It's clear from the story DC knew what Marvel was doing, and it was something related to the original Secret Wars, but they only had the original to fall back on and rip off. This is why Telos, a major character in the Convergence event, is such an obvious ripoff of the Beyonder. Telos drives the story in a similar way to the Beyonder in the original Secret Wars, even forcing various gathered heroes and villains to fight each other on a strange, artificially created planet. He also has the same sort of ambivalent morality to him, and even shares the same sense of presence, being larger in life and bigger in scope than an ordinary sentient being. Yes, there are aspects of Telos that are original. His ties to Brainiac tether him to the DC universe in a unique way the Beyonder didn't benefit from. But it's simply not enough to make him all that distinct from the Beyonder, who is just more interesting on the whole. And then after all that, it turns out the Beyonder wasn't really in the 2015 Secret Wars to begin with, so they couldn't even successfully rip off the thing they were trying to rip off. Number 2. Imperiex, ripoff of Galactus. Imperiex was originally a Superman villain created in the year 2000, and later was the main villain of a pretty forgettable event called Our Worlds at War. The biggest issue to me is that both Marvel's Galactus and Imperiex are these cosmic beings contained in a suit of armor and embody a sort of entropic element within the universe. Imperiex destroys worlds with the intent to recreate the universe. It's very similar to Galactus, to the point that I really can't define it as anything other than a ripoff. There's this one twist in Imperix's character that makes him a little bit different from Galactus, but beyond that, he's way too obvious of a ripoff to be considered anything else. I really can't believe DC thought they could get away with a copy that obvious, and it probably goes away to explain why the character has hardly reappeared since Our Worlds at War. Number 1. Rocket Red. Ripoff of Iron Man, Titanium Man, and Crimson Dynamo. It's just so ridiculous. After Marvel's success with Iron Man, and even after Marvel basically copied the character to a limited degree with a Soviet flair, creating villainous versions of Iron Man in the form of Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo, DC somehow thought it would be a good idea to feature a Soviet agent named Rocket Red, a Soviet villain who uses a suit of power armor. Clearly part of DC being unable to accept that at this point Marvel is very much cornered the market in terms of people in cool armored suits doing things. The best DC can hope for at this point is to occasionally put Batman in a mech suit, or whatever this was all about. So that's the end of the video. Thanks a lot for watching, and let me know what you think of my list of the worst ripoffs in Marvel and DC history. Do you agree? Any that you think that I missed? I will say that I tried to reserve my judgment when it came to characters that might have been ripoffs, but out of the gate were distinct in some way, that weren't on Joey's list, but I think could have belonged on a list more similar to the original one Joey created. A strong example of that is Zatanna and Scarlet Witch, two magical characters that were introduced to join something like the Justice League or the Avengers, and were even introduced in the same year, but had such different backstories, history, and attitude and design to them that I really had trouble thinking of them as real ripoffs. I like those characters, whereas a lot of the ones on this list I have a lot of reservations about, with the exception of ones that later became interesting, like Captain Boomerang, Boomerang, and of course Moon Knight. So that's the end of the video. Thanks a lot, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.